We are live. Yep, we're live. Hello, friends. We'll give it a few moments to let the room fill up before we get started. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Here is the link for tonight's event. We'll give it just a few minutes to, one more minute for the room to fill up. Welcome, friends. Hi, Beth. If you would like to put in the chat where you're joining us from today, you could do that. We're joining from Ohlone Land. This map is really great. It's interactive, lets you know any treaties that were in place at any time. Hey, I love the river of chat flowing through. It is our connection here in Zoom land. All right, I'm going to get going for tonight's event. Thank you so much for being here on a beautiful Tuesday evening. And this is part of our ongoing series with the Grotto, the Writers Grotto. And it's called Grotto Night at the Library, a conversation with writers. Tonight we have Louise Nayer and Saila Kariat. And we will be getting there in just a moment, but first a few announcements. The San Francisco Public Library would like to acknowledge that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We want to recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and as uninvited guests, we pay our respects to their ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. And you could find a lot in our doc for tonight, which if you have been to an event with me, you know I do this for all of our events. This has information to the library and upcoming events, as well as all the links to our presenters tonight. And if our presenters bring up books and resources, I will add those live as we go. So welcome, everyone. I do want to tell you about our upcoming events. The library has an ongoing literary campaign called On the Same Page. This is where we encourage all of San Francisco to read the same book at the same time. And for July and August, we are celebrating Fatima Oscar, and she will be in person live. That's right. She's coming to town specifically to talk to the San Francisco library community. So please turn out for the event. Sunday, August 27th, 3 p.m. in our beautiful Hormel Center. The book has hit the shelves today. You should find it, many copies available at your local library or 28 locations, or we have the ebook. So that is coming up. Please read, go to the book club if you want. It's a nice group. And if you didn't know, it's Summer Stride. This event counts towards Summer Stride. If you read, learn, explore 20 hours, you get that iconic San Francisco Public Library tote bag. I see a little peek of it here in this illustration. Any library has it. Do your 20 hours and bring it in. But we have lots of things happening over summer. We encourage you to come to all of them. Cooking, farmers market tours. July 15th is what we're really doing, is the huge event out at the new farm that's connected to Bay Native Nursery. And the new farm, we're going to have chickens and goats, the bookmobile. We'll have live music. We'll have hands-on craft and art, creative arts, screen printing, and crochet jam featuring Calixto and Ramicon. These are two very famous Bay Area artists. So please, July 15th, join us there. It is going to be so fun. All right. And now, again, without further ado, I'm excited to have you here tonight for tonight's event with Louise Nayer and Saila Kariat. And this is Grotto Night, and we have 2 more coming up, and it's in that doc. July 11th and August 8th, we have 2 more Grotto Nights. And then hopefully we'll be taking this live and in person. We'll see how it goes. Tonight we have Louise Nayer, who has written 6 books, 2 poetry books, Keeping Watch and The Houses Are Covered in Sound, and co-authored How to Bury a Goldfish, about rituals for everyday life. Burned, a memoir, was an Oprah Great Read and won the Wisconsin Library Association Award. She's also the author of Poised for Retirement, Moving from Anxiety to Zen, and her latest book, Narrow Escapes. Louise is a member of the Writers Grotto, a longtime educator, retired City College of San Francisco professor, and now teaches through Ollie, UC Berkeley, and at the Grotto. She's done numerous radio spots, including on NPR. Saila Kariat is a writer, filmmaker, entrepreneur who has pursued a career as an electrical engineer, a builder while dreaming of writing and filmmaking. After obtaining her PhD in electrical engineering, she worked as an engineer, manager, and marketer at IBM. She studied filmmaking at San Jose State University and was valedictorian of the class of 2008. After making several short films, she wrote, directed, and co-produced the feature, The Valley, the story of an Indian American entrepreneur seeking answers after the suicide of his daughter. The Valley was selected by over 20 film festivals and won Best Feature Film in 4, notably being invited to the Mumbai Film Festival. Her current work is Jesus Land, an adaptation of the New York Times best-selling novel by the same name. She is in development on the movie based on the memoir. Kariat has published many technical articles as a research staff member at IBM T.J. Watson Research Center. Her feature screenplays include Gods and Demons, Love in a Time of Corona, Release and Gray. She has started writing essays and short stories, a few of which have been published. She is also a member of the Writers Grotto, Film Fatales, and the San Francisco Film. Without further ado, Saila and Louise. Please unmute yourselves.
Well, I'll begin and then Saila will chime in, but we're really excited to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's such an amazing topic, searching for home, because that's something everybody wants and everybody has tried to create. And I guess I will start by asking Saila our first question, which is, Saila, how do you define home?
Thanks, Louise. And thank you for having us, Public Libraries, SF Public Library. You know, I've been giving this a lot of thought since we started talking about this topic, Louise. And I think home for me is a place where you feel safe and secure and comfortable. And it's a place where you kind of long for permanence. It's the elusive permanence. There really is no such thing, but in our mind, when we think of home, we want it to be permanent. We want a sense of stability, and I think that's what makes it so hard to find home.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll ask you the same question: what does home mean to you?
Well, you know, I think very much the same things: safety, security, comfort. Not always surrounded by people you love, because I lived alone for 7 years in my 20s, and I created a home with my, poetry books and objects that I loved, and that was home. And now I feel, a big part of my home is living with my husband and my dog. So pets have always been important parts of my home. And also, and this is kind of interesting. We just painted our house. You can see this green behind me. And I had no paintings on the walls for days. And I found this big photo that we had framed of my daughters. And I just put it up yesterday. And I just took a deep breath. So sometimes I think, well, I'm not really materialistic, but special objects that you can look at and have in front of you are really important.
Mhm. Very true. So much of your book, I want to talk a little bit about your first book, Burned, which I read about a year ago. It talks about, your parents had a tragic accident where they were badly burned, and your mom was was disfigured, and so was your dad. They had health problems as a result, and how this trauma kind of shaped your life. And I am, by the way, reading this Narrow Escapes, and I have to say I love this book.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I love Burned also, but I love this book. And partly because I can relate so much to the narrator's voice. It seems to be more about what shaped you as an individual. You left home and you're going on this really kind of courageous journey. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, it was really interesting because after writing Burned, I just thought, I'm never going to write another memoir. You have to be so transparent, and they're real people. But I started writing an essay about my journey in Morocco, where I actually hitchhiked. It was the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, there were people standing on street corners all over Europe and all over the world, sticking their thumbs out. So, I was part of a wave of people. But I wrote an essay about Morocco, which didn't get published. And the person said, well, it doesn't have an arc. And then I sent it in again. It didn't get published. And then she said, well, maybe you need to write a book about it. I never really wanted to do that. But this journey, really coming of age, that time between 20 and 30, where you're breaking from your parents, trying to find your path. And I knew I wanted to be a poet early on. So, I found, but I just kept going with it. And then I also realized, when you bring up the trauma, for people who don't know, Burned is about my parents. Well, you mentioned who were burned in an accident, and how trauma or difficult experiences follow you, through teenagehood and in trying to form relationships and all kinds of things. So, that was part of how that continued, in this book. Yeah, I can ask you, Saila, about, your film. That I just watched it again, and I just encourage everybody to watch it. It's called The Valley, and I guess you can see it on what, Peacock?
On Peacock, it's on Roku, Tubi TV, and Freebie, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a powerful film of our time, of people getting, an Indian family living in Silicon Valley, and, just surrounded by people who are driven to make money, driven to climb the ladder, driven to have their kids go to the perfect school. And it's even bigger than just Silicon Valley, because it's also about a family that sadly isn't listening to each other, and the daughter commits suicide. And afterwards is, why didn't we talk to her? Why didn't we find out what was going on? And it's so beautifully filmed. But I guess my question is, what inspired you to write it, and how does it fit with our topic of searching for home?
So what inspired me, I mean, there are several things. I grew up as an immigrant, as an outsider. I was talking to you earlier about how there's so many similarities between the Jewish culture and the Indian culture.
Mhm.
There's a lot of, emphasis on getting the right degrees and, status and making money. And so that whole, high pressure situation is something that I feel it's all accentuated in Silicon Valley. Everyone is, they're like on steroids, and so I feel all of those pressures are quadrupled, and that I observed it and seeing my children going through the school system, and all the things they faced. And so that was part of what the inspiration. The other part of it is I had a brother who was schizophrenic, and he passed away actually right before I started writing the script.
Wow.
And that just the tragic nature of his life and mental health issues and how there's a lot of shame in the Indian community around mental health issues. And I mean, it's changing. People are becoming more and more aware and more open-minded about it. They're, akin to physical health issues. I mean, if you have diabetes, you have diabetes. If you have schizophrenia, you have it's an imbalance of the chemical imbalance of the brain. And so, that was partly the inspiration. And I think there is, the way it relates, I think displaced people really feel that painful loss of home and the searching for home. And what people do is try to substitute something else for it. And in a lot of times in Silicon Valley, in a place like this, it's materialism or, ambition. Workaholism is a substitute for that loss of community and the loss of connection and the loss that of home.
Yeah.
And that becomes kind of like a poor substitute. And I think people a lot of times don't even realize what it is they're searching for,
Yeah. And, I was just thinking about the similarities because definitely, everything was about education in my family. And when I did around 2021, I think the effect of, the accident, leaving home after, college, that transition from leaving college, I started to have panic attacks. And my dad, who was a doctor, the first few times that I told him what was wrong, he just said, well, take a deep breath, and in other words, he wanted to be able to fix it, but he couldn't fix it. And finally, when I said, well, I'd like to see a therapist, it was so hard to get out those words because I felt I had failed. And also my mother was disfigured facially. And I was thinking, well, she got through life without therapy, so how should I? So there's a similarity there. And sadly, I don't think the mental health system is a lot better, but yeah, certainly not, quote, fixed and all of that. So we have similarities there for sure.
I think one other point, in this is commonality. When immigrants, when they leave home, like my parents, they came from, very humble beginnings. Like my dad grew up in a village where there's no running water and no electricity, and he literally had to walk 6 miles to go to school. That whole, cliche, oh, I had to walk 6 miles. He literally had to cross a river and walk 6 miles to go to school.
Wow.
And so those beginnings, your problems, if you say I'm lost, I feel lost and I'm searching for home, I'm searching for identity, they don't understand that. They think, oh, well, we had it so much worse.
Right.
What are you complaining about? These are not real problems. In their mind, real problems have to do with deeper, darker, harder things. And I think you face some of that in your situation because you were feeling, especially I see in your book, you're feeling lost, you're trying to find yourself. But your parents had such a difficult trauma in their life that your problems looked kind of minor compared to theirs.
Yeah, I think it was very difficult because I was very privileged financially. My mother was very frugal and grew up in the Depression, but I went to summer camp. I went to this very artsy private school. And so there was a part of me that thought, well, why do I feel sad or what's happening? because there wasn't any real intervention. So I think there was a kind of guilt, and some of it could be a type of survivor's guilt too. I wasn't physically burned, and yet when I wrote Burned and did a talk at the Phoenix Society, which is a burn survivors group, they said anybody in the family can be called a burn survivor. And, it just opened it up that everybody goes through things. But in terms of finding home, and that accident, I think that there was a lack of safety deep inside me. As much as I was privileged and I had a beautiful home and my mother had paintings and, she had enough Colgate toothpaste in the closet and everything was set. But yeah, there was a lack of that safety, although I liked being home because I liked being contained in this kind of safe environment, but inside I didn't really feel it.
Mm-hmm.
But I was going to ask you about your mother, because you said your mother was very religious and traditional. And so how was it straddling two cultures? And and also you moved a lot. You went to 5 high schools. So how did that affect your, the straddling two cultures and the moving? How did that affect your search for home?
I think I think to some degree, everyone goes through a little of this, the whole transition of feeling, when you're young, you're kind of assuming you come from a good family, you're kind of feeling safe and home. And then you grow up and you start going out into the world and you separate from your family, all that transition, and you figure out your own identity. It's kind of natural for everyone. But when you're in my situation, where your home life and your life at school look like 2 different universes,
Yeah,
it makes it very hard to figure out what your identity is. Like the values that my mom were so different than the values that were, in the Canadian. Most of my developing years, I was in Canada. And that in Canada, the values were very different. Like my mother would never think of dating as an acceptable option, and whereas everyone was dating in high school. And so, that was all that kind of confusion was really hard to deal with. What is good? What is bad? What is right? What is wrong? You have to kind of look inward to figure those things out, because outside, everyone's telling you something different.
Yeah.
And that makes, and it's hard to feel at home. Even in your home,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You're in the state of confusion, and there's this kind of rigidity in your home life that you don't understand or relate to. I mean, the other aspect is that in Indian culture, the women, and I think this is true of Jewish culture also, it's pretty chauvinistic, like, all the men eat first, then the women eat, and the women are doing all the housework and the men don't do much. And there's just so much, there's so many in those days. I mean, things have changed so much now. I mean, I'm
Right.
talking about 50, 60 years ago,
Right.
50 years ago, that it was, and my mom's generation, it was totally different. And those and also just generally, women are not treated as of equal value as men. They're less value. They simply have less value. And that is something I could never agree with. So I found all these things that I felt like uncomfortable with and I didn't agree with. And so searching for home became a very complicated, convoluted thing for me. And we moved I lived in so many different places.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why home has a special place, I think, for people like us.
Yeah. And I think, in a very small way, one thing I can relate to is that my parents sent us to a very artsy, progressive school, and this was in the early 50s, and the kids were wearing blue jeans. And my mother was very strict. And so she said, you can't wear jeans to school, even though everybody else was wearing it. So my sister and I would actually cover each other in the stairwell going down our apartment building and change into jeans. and then stuff our dresses, so there were little things like that. And one thing that I guess we had talked about is that my mother was Christian and my father was Jewish.
Mhm.
And because my grandfather was a minister and really wanted us to go to church, actually he baptized my sister when they were babysitting for her one night. It was very confusing because my school was mainly made up of some Jewish Christian families, but they were basically atheists and not religious, and certainly didn't go to church. So I think I was the only person who went to church. And I must say, part of a longing for me as I've gotten older is wanting more of the Jewish culture, because that was really kind of wiped out, actually. It was just not really. One time I said to my mother, well, I'm half Jewish. And she said, no, you're not. You were baptized and confirmed in the Episcopalian Church. So there was a way in which that part of my identity wasn't really acknowledged, and there's been a longing for that. I have a question for you. I know you've moved around so much, and you've also written about, the difficulty in Silicon Valley, but in what place do you feel most at home?
It's a really good question. And I feel like I was actually born in Berkeley, and then I left Berkeley when I was like 2 years old or something, and I ended up back close to Berkeley. So I think where I am right now is where I feel most at home. This is where I've lived longest in my life, is the Bay Area. And it's very diverse, and I feel it's very accepting of people, whoever, whatever, faith, sexual orientation, color, ethnicity, whatever. Everyone seems to belong here and don't belong here. It's a strange dichotomy. It's like it's interesting because I feel like almost everyone is an immigrant. There are very few native Californians. They came from somewhere else, either the South or the, East Coast, New York, somewhere. And they kind of came and converged here. So you don't have to go back too many generations to find that they came from somewhere else. So I feel like it's a good, it's somewhere where I actually can feel good and happy. The other thing I feel, and here's this is interesting, is I've formed a group of artists, and which I never, because I, as the bio said, I transitioned from engineering, which was, again, here was the acceptable profession, right? It was more steady, more stable. It was a real job, versus if you say I'm a writer, when you're young, they'll say, well, that's not a real job, So I feel much more comfortable amongst writers and filmmakers than I ever felt amongst engineers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. See.
And that's, in a sense, that's a home for me.
Exactly.
Because I think by nature, writers are a bit of outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
They're people who feel things more deeply, and they're searching for truth. It's like people have layers of existence, right? You have your real, who you really are, and people who are very close to you, like your spouse or your children, they know that. And then there's a whole layer of who you might be in your professional life, and then there's an even more superficial layer, so with writers, I think they try to look through all of the different layers, peel back the onion, and look at what the core of a person is and what the real truths are of life.
Yeah. And just as you were talking, I was thinking, home is also where you can show your authentic self, really your deepest feelings, and feel that you're not going to be demeaned, or, you're, quote, overly sensitive, or all those things you were saying about artists.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you can be yourself, and sometimes you were saying with groups of writers, sometimes home can be when you're engaged in a project. you can feel so at home with a group of people. And sometimes if you work on a play and then it's the last night, there's this sudden feeling of emptiness because you've been with these people for so long and you've created something, and that's part of home. And actually, this would be a good segue into looking at some of the art and queuing up the trailer for Saila's film, The Valley. So Anise, if you could do that, that would be great. Thank you.
I was dreaming about when she was little. She was so serene. Always so sensitive. I keep thinking we'll wake up and everything will be exactly as it was.
It's strange. She hasn't been in my dreams.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The technology we're about to unveil today is called Oprah.
Have you thought about stepping down?
These are my ideas. Mankind has always been fascinated with predicting the future.
What difference will it make? Will it bring her back?
What if we could make this process scientific? What really happened that night?
Do you need a reason?
I'm gonna try and find out.
I did the right things to I miss her.
She was sweet, innocent.
Do not tell anyone. It can destroy your entire family.
Stop pretending now. I know.
Leave it alone. It'll only bring you heartache.
But the answer isn't in the individual pieces. It's all about strong connections. I'm having a really hard time understanding.
Yeah, I mean, that film is powerful on so many levels. And one thing that I was thinking about is that, you know, the phrase "we're human beings, not human doings." You know, it's not that you have to keep doing something and proving yourself. And I remember David Brooks, the writer, commentator, was saying that, you know, when you die, nobody really is going to care about your resume. They're going to care about what kind of person you were. You know, were you kind? Were you generous? Did you help people? And so the film really points that out. I mean, it's set in Silicon Valley, but it's so universal, and also about parenting, you know, that, you know, and we're both actually parents of two daughters. And, you know, how do you really connect with your children and listen to them? Because for their mental health, it's so important. And there's been an explosion of anxiety and depression among young people recently with the pandemic and climate change. So, you know, the film's message is even more powerful for parents. So, yeah, I was so moved by it.
Well, thank you so much. You know, one of the people that saw it told me afterwards, you know, it made me want to go home and hug my children. And I thought, okay, if it has that effect, then it's good, you know, if
Exactly.
that's what it does for you. But speaking of anxiety, one of the things as I was reading your book, I knew you talked in your book about having panic attacks and having anxiety, and it's a natural, you know, effect of the accident that your parents underwent, because you're always afraid of some, you know, impending catastrophe, you know, that, and, you know, it's very, we can all empathize with it. But the thing that really struck me as I was reading your book is how brave you were. like there were so many instances like where you're in Spain and you jump out of a car and you end up going to Morocco and you're hitchhiking with this young 20-year-old girls and you're with these men. And I'm like, each time I was gripping my chair as I was reading this, like going, oh my God, I hope nothing happens here. I mean, how did you get the courage to go through that? You were definitely searching for something. And what prompted you? What were you searching for? And how did you get the courage?
Well, it's interesting because that period of time in some ways doesn't feel individual to me. It feels like, in terms of the late 60s, early 70s, the civil rights movement, reproductive rights, which sadly are being taken away now, but and the consciousness, some of it was drugs, certainly, acid, what people were seeing with the world. It felt like we were very much, even I'm saying it now, we were a we. It was this really longing to just change the world and anti-war. I mean, to stop wars, to have peace and love, which, the media kind of made fun of. So in some ways, yeah, I was individually searching, but I was also swept up in the consciousness of the times. And in terms of bravery, it's interesting. I was thinking about this. My mother, despite the fact that she was facially disfigured, she traveled the world with my dad, even after the accident. She loved adventures and she loved to go places. And as soon as she got home, she'd be planning a trip for the next year, where can we go, and kind of drag my father, who ended up having a good time. So in some ways, I was affected by her in a good way, that life is about adventure, and we did have the resources to travel. So that was very lucky, but just getting out there and seeing the world and doing things. So I think it was a combination of, the times and adventure, and the bigger bravery for me was getting close to people in relationships. I think driving cross country by myself, traveling to Morocco, didn't really feel brave. It felt like I was just part of this whole movement. But, the more difficult things, learning to trust, those were the deeper fears, really.
That's very profound. Can you read us something from your book that,
Yeah, I have a very short section where in some ways I felt totally free. And, that's a hard feeling, especially if you grow up like I grew up, or we were talking about the cultures where, you're supposed to be this, you're supposed to be that, you're supposed to have the, in my case, the perfect boyfriend, the perfect job, all of that. So when I drove cross country by myself, I drove in a 68 Camaro, no air conditioning, no radio, just poems spinning through my mind. So I'll just read this very short section. I had just gotten this little black hood that I needed to keep my car from overheating. On the road again, the black hood neatly over the radiator, protecting me, protecting the car, a new talisman of sorts. New York City, where my heart had started inside my mother's body and outside her body at New York Hospital, now faded away. The further I went, with the change in time, the earlier it became, like being born again. What was freedom? Lack of restrictions? Out here on the road, no one was telling me what to do or what not to do. School, a boyfriend who would become a husband, a job, enough money, a place to live, a bank account, publications of my writing in the right magazines, the ones that would lead to bigger and better magazines, everything always bigger and better, as if life were to be one great crescendo, rising to some peak like Everest, where I would stake my claim, drape a big flag that I'd made it to the top. Voices swirled in my head, the shoulds of life. In the car between places, The voices descended to a soft whisper. The time inside my Camaro was all my time. Crazy images spun through my brain. Trees like dancers, the blue sky a silken robe, the cars in front of me, huge beetles, the road an alleyway to the heart, my heart not broken on this stretch of road. Maybe my heart had never really been broken when my parents disappeared. I wanted to believe that, I was always trying to get to an unbroken heart. These thoughts, Olympic runners of the air, like a spinning wheel or a player piano, went so fast I couldn't catch them, but I knew they were there and all mine.
Very nice.
Yeah, and poetry was a home for me, and I found that path early. So I was lucky in that way.
Very beautiful.
Thank you. And I was going to ask you this question, where you grew up with little money, but you believed in the American dream and you achieved financial success. But when Trump was elected, how did that affect your feelings about the American dream?
So when I was growing up in Canada, so this would be in the 70s and the early 80s, there was a lot of discrimination against Indians, because there were Native Americans and then South Asians, and they were the visible minority back then. And so it was a lot like England, there was the Paki, you go outside and you'd be called Paki, or like I remember when I was one of my high schools, my first week, somebody wrote "Paki, you stink" on my locker. So these were kind of things that you had to face. And so when I moved to the US in the early 80s, I thought, oh my God, this is it. I've arrived. Because people were very different than back in the early 80s in New York. New York is very liberal, as you know, you're from New York. It's very accepting, and it's like a big melting pot of a lot of different kinds of people. And so I felt very much like America was so much better, and I drank the Kool-Aid. I came to America with $100, literally.
Wow.
I ended up getting admission into Syracuse. I worked for 8 months. I saved money. I got a Pell Grant. I did all kinds of stuff before able to afford, 1 year of college, basically. And then I, went on and I got an assistantship, and I basically put myself through graduate school. And then I got a job, and, it was all like I never really got any help. So it was like, I pull yourself up by the bootstraps and, be innovative, and you work hard and you'll make it, that kind of, I really believed all of that. And you'll be treated just like everyone else. Of course, there's the corollary to that. And I think that last part kind of was shaken over the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
As I got to see more and more, I feel like the message is you'll be treated like everyone else, but the reality is not. And even, if you do all of the above, you're a good citizen, you don't commit crimes, you pay your taxes, you still don't get treated the way that others of the same who have done the same thing get treated. And, really Trump is kind of, an in-your-face, testament to that, right?
Totally.
Here's a person who openly, embraces racism. I mean, in both, subtle and non-subtle forms, and yet 40% of the population still supports them.
Yeah.
And it's obviously not a deal breaker for 40% of the population. So that shows something. And
and that
was very disillusioning for me.
Yeah, and you show that in your film too, where the father, who's Indian, doesn't get invited to the president's house. In other words, these things that just, eat at people, because they're being demeaned. And, you could call it subtle, but it's not really subtle. It's just out there, racism. And so you really show that well, and had to deal with that. And yeah, I keep thinking, Trump is the last gasp of, the patriarchy or the white supremacists, but we'll see, let's hope.
We'll see. I mean, we'll find out, I guess.
Yeah. But, that's another aspect of home. You want to feel that, you're accepted by your community and not marginalized and not, not treated badly just because of who you are. I'm not sure how much time we have left. I mean, there was one last question I was going to ask you, and I can answer it too, but do you feel you found home? I guess in some ways you've answered that, or are you still searching? In some ways you answered that, but you might want to add.
I think there's a part of me that will always be searching.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's partly because of, being an immigrant and being, visibly different, I don't know. Sometimes I think, there's certain choices that I wouldn't make that somebody else could easily. For example, I love Austin, Texas as a town. I think it's great. The music scene, the film scene, everything is wonderful. But being a brown person, I don't think I would ever want to live in Austin, Texas, or live in Texas. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Texans, but I hope I'm not offending anyone out there. But it's not a choice I would make. So the point I'm trying to make is there's always some part of me that's feeling like, okay, is this really my home or is it not? Or, am I really accepted here or am I not? And I think it will always be like that. I don't think I could go back. Like if I go back to India, I'm like a fish out of water.
Right.
Everyone's thought patterns, culture, everything is different. I know I don't fit there. Even my parents don't fit there anymore. They've lived here for so many years. That's what happens to immigrants when you migrate. And to some extent, it's happened to every American, because you've migrated from somewhere, maybe Europe, maybe Italy. So if you ask an Italian American, go back to Italy and live there, they would feel very, out of place, I think. Most Italian Americans.
Yeah.
So, it happens to everyone in America to some degree.
Yeah. And I also think that, home gets imprinted on you really early. So I was thinking about New York City, and there's a subway stop on 14th Street, and it literally smells of cotton candy and urine. It's just this mixture of city smells, kind of sickly sweet, but it kind of feels like home to me. A lot of people would say, oh my God, that's really awful. And yet, so there's a way in which New York City will always be my home. And there's also an intensity about New York, where people talk a lot or talk loudly and it's all okay. It's cab drivers screaming and, all of that. And even I remember going to summer camp and I was thinking, what is this noise? It was the crickets. I was used to hearing the sounds of sirens, ambulance sirens, and that was just part of the city. So I think you get imprinted really early on. So yeah, as much as I guess for me, that question is, the older I get, the more I find that nature really calls to me and is my home. I was thinking even going camping, being in a tent, it feels like home because it's so beautiful outside. And so New York City, you can get out of New York, but it doesn't have that kind of constant beauty that San Francisco has. And I'm very lucky. I'm looking out at this beautiful garden that my husband basically created. And so I can have that much more easily out here. So there's a way in which I'm getting pulled more towards California. I've really resisted it in a lot of ways for many years.
I find also as I get older, I think more than a place, it's the people that start to matter to me.
Totally.
If I'm surrounded by my family, my husband, my children, my friends, like what I would miss most about this area are my friends and if my whole family moved, let's say, I think I would really miss my friends and my grotto people. And, it's like, those are the things that I feel more attached to than the actual place or the objects around me. It's become more of an internal process and a process of those that are close to me, the feeling of home,
Yeah.
and maybe that feels comfortable,
Yeah, well, I think that that's so much what home is, having, a spouse who's a best friend. And I've mentioned pets, and you have a dog too. I feel so, my dog really brought me through so much during the pandemic. And I think that's true for a lot of people. You saw all these people with new puppies suddenly. Yeah. So, yeah, just having that.
part of your love circle,
Exactly. Yeah.
So should we take some questions?
Sure. I see one question that was early on. They were talking about Stephanie Fu's book, which is called, let's see, I put it in the chat. It's called What My Bones Know. And the person was talking about how they were reminded of parents' trauma and how that, gets intergenerational. And they were wondering how you absorbed that and how you then put it out in writing.
Okay. Was that for, I could start by answering it. Yeah, it's called, different intergenerational trauma, vicarious trauma. It's very hard not to pass that down, and, I think in my case that I've gotten tremendous help with looking at it and seeing how it affects my life. And also when I wrote Burned, at first it was a more what about me kind of book. I suffered too, even though I don't have the burns, I suffered too. And then the book became a book also about my parents, because how did they cope with suddenly being, having their children wrenched for them for 9 months and dealing with the hospital stays. So I think it's so important for children, mainly as they get older, to understand, what their parents were dealing with and had to go through, whether, and in my parents' cases, we were talking about the American dream. They had arrived, that summer that they were burned. My dad was a doctor and he didn't come from money really, and my mother either. And then suddenly, boom, and then how do you cope with that? And but talking about mental health, it's just so important to be open, to listen to both sides, what the parents go through and what the children go through. But Saila, you might have more thoughts about that question too.
Yeah, I think when you're younger, you basically, your parents, the way you view them is how they treat you and what they do for you and what they didn't do for you. And then the older you get, the more you see them as individuals, and what they went through. And as difficult as it was for me to be an immigrant, it was more difficult for them because they grew up, they were basically were a stranger in a strange land. They couldn't relate. I could somewhat relate to the outside culture. They couldn't relate. They could hardly relate. And things were not, this is something also that has changed so much in the last 50 years is the globalization has changed people's understanding of other cultures and their kind of level of knowledge about other cultures. Back when in the early 70s or the early 80s, people didn't know. They would come to me and say, "What are you?" And I would say, "I'm Indian." And they would say, "Are you Apache or Cherokee?" That was the level of knowledge. They had no understanding that there's a country like India. Whereas now, I mean, like my daughter had they had a presentation about India and they asked us to help. And so we did this PowerPoint, me and one other lady, and we took a bunch of food. I cooked a whole, bunch of food to take. And this little 6-year-old kid came to me and said, "Oh, I love saag paneer." I was like, I was ready to fall out of the chair. I said, not only did he know what it was, he knew the name, the Indian name.
Right.
That was, and whereas, in the early 80s, no one would know, what that was. You couldn't even find an Indian restaurant where, where we lived. So it was a different time. And I sorry, I digressed here, but yeah.
Yeah, but I wanted to add to that when I was traveling in Morocco and other places, I didn't want these sanitized type trips that my parents went on, with the itineraries, even though there's something very comforting about that now that I'm older, but I didn't necessarily want that. I really wanted to be with, quote, the real people. And even though there were risks with that, my friend and I got invited into the home of a Moroccan family, and we were strangers to them, and they just invited us into their home. And so I really wanted that kind of travel. So I think on the one hand, there's globalization, but it doesn't mean that people are really, really understanding somebody's culture. So it takes a real openness, beyond, I mean, the food is very important, but beyond that too,
Right.
to really understand somebody else's culture.
No, I agree. But at least at a superficial level, they know something.
Yeah, that little 6-year-old. That's great.
But, at a deeper level, it takes years to really understand a culture. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
you have to live amongst them for years, and then you sort of get an idea. And
Yeah.
also language is a huge barrier.
Totally.
If you don't know the language of a culture, it's very hard to understand that culture.
Yes.
Okay, we also have, there's a lot of thank yous going on in the chat. I hope you can see that. Thank you both for your beautiful reflections. To what extent was your acceptance of Berkeley/SF as your home's intentional or incidental? Did you have to be in a certain life stage to accept even having a home? Shall I read those questions again?
Well, do you want to hear it again, Saila, or?
No, I think
Yeah, no. I have just a quick thought is, I mean, in my book, I got what it was equivalent of an MFA from SUNY Buffalo, and I was probably going to go back to New York City and look for a job. I don't know in what with an MFA at that point, but something. And a friend of mine called me from Berkeley and said, "Oh, I have an extra room in my house because I'm leaving. Do you want my room?" I'd never been to California, and I just said yes. So, and called my mother and said, "I'm moving to California." So it was so impulsive, and I'm not usually that impulsive, and so it was just, so that's how I ended up on the West Coast. And I kept trying to move back to New York, but then I got a California Arts Council grant as a poet in residence for senior centers and nursing homes. I taught poetry to older people, and those grants supported me as an artist. And I knew I couldn't say no to that. So I remember having a dream of the California sun, and I was in New York then, and I just came back, and my mother cried, and she never cried much at all, but she cried when I drove away. I think she knew I was really going far away for a long time, but it was totally impulsive how I ended up here.
And for us, it was actually kind of a fluke, because my husband and I were working on a startup, and we had absolutely no money to finance this thing. So we got money from a venture capitalist, but he said the only way he would give us money is if we moved out here. And so that's why we ended up moving out here. And then over time, it became more and more of a home. And I realized, that this is a good place for us.
Yeah. And I think when I met my husband, who was working at the Haight-Ashbury Senior Center, where I was the poet in residence, and we created a home together, it was okay, and family, I'm going to stay here. Then that was pretty clear. And I think when you have kids too, you're engaged in so much, their schools, their activities. So there's a home in that too, in the whole system.
Thank you. Someone's given you a writing prompt, so here we go. What would you do if you were encouraged to write the next great chapter of the American story? In an email response from the White House after sending a poem out of your poetic memoir.
Whoa, could you read that again?
Sure. What would you do if you were encouraged to write the next chapter of the American story? In an email response from the White House after sending in a poem out of your poetic memoir. I think there's a little typo, but Caro, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question in person. I can make that happen.
Yeah, so the thing is, actually, I received an email response from the White House after I sent in the poem. So that's why I was kind of asking you guys if you were to receive something like that from the White House.
Wow, that's really exciting. I would be totally thrilled. And yeah, it's all I can say is it's very thrilling, and it must have been a poem that really meant something, and was important. I'm not sure what the poem talked about, but it must have been a great poem.
It was about our world, because the title was Our World and talking about war. So.
Oh yeah, well,
yeah,
very important topics.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really exciting. How about what are you reading now? What's on your nightstand?
No, Saila. Oh,
Good one. Good one.
Brilliant book. I would read it again once I finish. It's really a beautiful book. Recommended highly.
And library friends, we do have it on order, so don't worry. But if you do want to go get it from a local author. I mean, a local independent bookstore.
Yeah, there are some copies of Green Apple on the park. I know. Yeah, I'm reading a book. Oh gosh, what's the whole title? It's about a stationery store. It takes place in Iran in the 50s, during the rise of the Shah. And it's about two young people who fall in love, and the young man is an activist. So it's a kind of dangerous love story. And I think at the very end of the book, it's actually earlier on that she's been married, but she meets him again. And so that's part of the story too. And it's pretty compelling. I really like it.
The stationery shop. I put it in the
shop. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Yeah.
So you don't do the read 5 books at a time?
I'm not good at that at all. I'm like, I have to focus on one thing, or I'm just not good at reading 5 books at a time.
Thanks, Beth. We'll try to get, Beth, are you talking about get narrow on Access 360? We can definitely try to do that. Okay. We can try. Let's see. How about any favorite children's picture books about searching for or finding home?
It's been so long since I've, read children's books to children or grandchildren, but there's some book about, looking for my mom. Are you my mama? Is that a children's book? I remember that. And I'm thinking, yeah, mama is home. So there are a lot of books like that. Yeah. Any more questions or?
Louise, I can ask you a question that I had.
Sure.
Do you feel that searching for home is more of an external process or an internal one? Like first you're kind of physically leaving, you go to France and then you go to Morocco and then you go to California. So you're kind of moving from place to place. But do you feel that, the internal journey that you were taking is really almost more about searching for home?
Yeah, I think that, I even remember one time being at a friend's house and looking at a map and thinking, oh, I could live here, I could live there, I could live here. So there was that sense of adventure externally. I think the internal journey allowed me to create a home. I think it wasn't until I had this counseling session called co-counseling with a friend. And she said, what do you want to work on? And I'd never mentioned the accident, hardly to anybody. And I was 24. And I suddenly realized that's what I have to work on, in order to feel, I guess, safe enough to love somebody deeply, to have children, and yeah, I mean, definitely I've been an anxious mother, but I've always been working on that too. But I think to get to that point, and sometimes, and not everybody has to have a partner, there are different choices in life, but I definitely felt like I had to go through something very deep. And I guess in a sad way, I guess I had to leave home to do it. And that's a little bit of the sadness. I think, maybe I could have stayed in New York, but maybe having my parents so close and everything there, it would have been harder to really go so deeply into what I needed to go through. So yeah, there are two levels of the journey, external and internal. Yeah.
Yeah, for me also, I feel there was a lot of internal journey for me, because I think growing up in such a place which had a lot of discrimination, I kind of felt ashamed of my roots. That was something I never quite accepted about myself. Like people would say, oh, you're an Indian American. They would always ask me questions about India, but I left India when I was 9 years old. Like they would ask me geographical questions. Like, where is this city relative to this city? And I was like, okay,
Right.
I scratch my head. Okay, remember my geography here. But so it was, they identified me that way, but that's not necessarily the way I identified myself, because I grew up, with Mary Tyler Moore and watching,
Right.
consuming all of the pop culture of the West, and kind of isolated. So
Do you feel more accepting of your culture now?
So yeah, that's something I really had to, as I grew older, I've grown more and more proud of it. And it's a little bit like what you feel about Judaism, like you want to know more about that, and I feel proud of the kind of fine qualities that old Indian culture has. Of the nonviolence, and the whole nonviolent movement was started by Gandhi. It was that whole it's part of, in Hindu culture, it's called ahimsa, which means nonviolence. Don't kill anything living. In fact, there's a whole sect called Jains, and when they walk, they sweep the ground in front of them because they don't want to step on a bug. That kind of gentleness is something I really learned to appreciate about the Indian culture, and other things. So it's something I allow myself now that I didn't allow myself when I was young.
Yeah.
And to accept that that's part of who I am, because that's what my parents are, and it comes from them. So that's part of, the journey. I feel is more internal in many ways.
Yeah. And it kind of comes full circle. It's in a very beautiful way, that you kind of come back to these roots that have always been there, but for whatever reason, well, for a lot of reasons that you mentioned, feeling ashamed or trying to fit in or all those things that, you don't necessarily embrace. Yeah, it's interesting. I think sometimes as people get older too, sometimes I was once bitten by a spider. I used to love them, but ever since that bite, I don't really love them. And so sometimes I will kill them, but now I'll apologize, really badly. Like, oh, I'm really sorry. You're probably not a bad spider, but I just don't know for sure. Yeah, the whole Charlotte Web syndrome. Yeah. But it's very beautiful. We're all, they're living creatures. We're just one of them, on the earth.
But we take one more question, and keep these questions do keep popping into my mind. Stephanie Foo's book, which is called I just had it, What My Bones Know. And Stephanie Foo was in conversation with us about a year and a half ago. And I put the link to that in the chat box as well as the doc, but she writes a lot about her parents' trauma and how it really affected her. So we have another question about in that line. How do you write a memoir about traumatic childhood and continuing deep family dysfunction without violating the privacy of family members who are still living?
Yeah, it's, well, I'll start. It's tough. I must say, and maybe my sister is on this call, but she helped me tremendously, with memories and all of that. And my parents had died before the final version came out, and in a way that made it easier. And I checked it out with my cousins, and one cousin was very upset that I said the dog was a basset hound because it wasn't a basset hound. It was another type of dog. But, and some other things that we talked about. I'm actually really believe that it's important to check things out unless you want to sever relationships with people. So I feel pretty good with Burned, that I checked it out mainly with my sister, but definitely with my cousins, and my parents had died. They knew I was writing the book before they died, but you get into all kinds of fun research too. And then if you love to write, and I just wanted to say to all of you, to many of you who are writers, you could even take the 5 senses and just think of a word that means home to you, like, smell, coffee. And so you create a rich world. And so that took precedence over a lot of the difficult things. But I think there are real ethical questions when you write memoirs, and it's always good to check it out with people.
Saila, would you like to respond to that?
This is why I write fiction, because in fiction, you can kind of disguise many real things in other characters and what other people say, but they're actually based on, tangentially on something real. And but that's a very gnarly question. I've never written a memoir, mostly because of that reason. I don't want to hurt people who would be written in, and yeah, it would be really difficult.
Yeah, and I changed some of the names in my new memoir. So,
but also Louise's book, I feel, is Burn was a very gentle treatment of the whole, her childhood. I mean, I feel her parents look like heroes in that book. I think they would have been proud of it.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's a lot about family, how family comes together to survive a tragedy like that. And that was what I found, it was so hard to read in some places, but it was so inspiring because they don't, fall apart. They actually come together, and there's such a, kindness in the people, in the parents and the sister, that I found it inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any more questions, friends? Let me make sure. I think we're looking good. I'm gonna come back on. Thank you, Louise and Saila. We so appreciate you sharing this amazing work with us tonight and just being so open and honest, and again, giving so many resources. The chat, I hope you were paying some attention. If not, I can always happy to send you the chat from that. And YouTube friends, we thank you for being here. Zoom registrants, we thank you for being here. Library community, we can't do this without you. So if you like this kind of program, virtual programming, just let us know. Keep coming, keep letting us know. And I'm going to throw in the link one more time for this document tonight with both Louise and Saila's links and where you can find their work. Saila, I have a question. Have you tried to get your movie on Canopy yet?
No, I have not actually. It's with a distributor, and he kind of
Mhm.
controls what happens to it, but I could suggest it.
Suggest it. You would be in libraries all over the world. Yeah, it's such a great feature. And I did look, it wasn't there, but there are many other places to see it. Everyone, thank you so much, and we'll see you next Grotto night, July 11th. July 11th. All right, friends. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.